Okay, so let's start. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hamburg Institute for Social Research. My name is Stefan Malthaner, and I'm a researcher here at the Institute. And I have the pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, Michel Naepels, from the Ecole des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, the French Institute, the French School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. We are indeed proud and happy to have him to give the second lecture within our lecture series on processes of violence. Maybe a few words on this lecture series. You probably have seen the flyers outside. In recent years, I would say, in very different fields of research on violence, there has been a development of increasingly seeking to analyze and explain violence by looking at the processes from which violence emerged, that is, at the sequences of events preceding acts of violence, at the gradual changes in relationships, perceptions, and interpretations that make violence more likely. Research on political violence, for example, has focused on or emphasized process of radicalization or escalation, making clear that violence cannot be explained in any simple or straightforward manner with reference to social structural factors, to so-called root causes, or to individual predispositions, and thereby making also clear that violence instead is the result of complex, dynamic, and interactive processes that precede moments of violence. And in this debate, or in this emerging and analytical perspective, or with this lecture series, we want to talk about this emerging perspective and discuss it. So I think one of the most interesting questions in this debate that I've been sketching very briefly is how do these processes, how do prior developments and relations actually affect and shape moments of violence, which often seem contingent and unpredictable and follow, as we know, for example, from the work of Randall Collins and others, their very own situational dynamic, which seems, at least to some extent, independent from everything that has happened before. And it is on exactly this point, and I'm sure you will realize this soon, that Michel's work offers unique insights. So Michel Naepels received his PhD in anthropology from the Ecole des Etudes in 1996. Since 2011, he is the Director of Studies, which at the school is a full professor, and he is also a research director at the CNRS. He is an anthropologist who particularly works on the field of political anthropology and has for more than 25 years done research in New Caledonia and more recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He has published numerous books and more than 50 articles, I think, and I would like to mention at least one of them, which is his book Quand gérer la guerre, more recently republished in English as War and Other Means, Power and Violence in Wailu and New Caledonia, which is, I think, a fantastic piece of political anthropology that combines history and ethnography within a very precise conceptual and theoretical framework. So with this said, we are very much looking forward to your talk. Please join me in welcoming Michel Naepels. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much. I would like first to thank the Institute for inviting me here tonight, especially to the Makrogewalt group, and also especially to Stefan Malthaner, who made me this wonderful proposal. I'm really sorry I'm not able to talk in German, and I'm sorry because my English is not very good neither, but I will try. And I'm also impressed because it's the first time I make a PowerPoint presentation. I think there should be technical problems in this kind of situations, so I hope not. So the aim of my research is to develop a political anthropology centered on the understanding of a current social situation. As Stefan said, I have been doing ethnographic fieldwork in a rural region of New Caledonia, Wailu, since 1991, and I am especially interested in situations of conflict and violence. So here is a map of the Western Oceania, the region usually called Melanesia, between Papua New Guinea down to New Caledonia. And here is the map of New Caledonia, and Wailu is in the center of this region. It's about 30 kilometers on 20 kilometers, and there are maybe 6,000 inhabitants. So there are not many people there. The fact of being included long enough in a social world in which the inquirer solicits comments on what happens there singularizes the ethnographic method. Observation and interlocution, including interviews, but not only interviews, just being there and talking with people, are constantly mixed in the investigation. So I carried out ethnographic fieldwork surveys in Wailu 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times between 1991 and 2009. I think maybe around, I spent maybe 2 years and a half in New Caledonia, which led me to publish 2 books, 2 monographs on New Caledonia. And as Stefan mentioned, the second one has been translated into English, and it's quite wonderful because the publisher, the Australian National University Press, make their book downloadable for free. So if you wish to read about Oceania, not only my book, but any book, you can do it legally for free, so it's quite great. After this book, I began another research in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in a rural part of Katanga. I won't comment on tonight. In Wailu, my general objective was to approach the place as a political anthropologist in order to describe and to contextualize a situation in which any social relationship is ambivalent. Depending on the circumstances, 2 individuals put forward the links that unite them or the conflicts that divide them. It's quite strange to meet people who say, I can't stand my neighbor, he wants to kill me by sorcery and so on. And then 2 days after, in a ritual or ceremonial setting, you just see both talking and laughing together and being there, united in this situation, even if they can oppose in other situations. So I took internal conflicts and violent actions as a guiding thread of the description of the political action of the Kanak people of Wailu today, wondering what I could learn of the transformation since the colonization of New Caledonia by France in 1853. So I have to put a warning here. The word Kanak is derived from the Polynesian Hawaiian word Kanaka, meaning human being, and it designated in the 19th century all Melanesians from New Guinea to New Caledonia in the vocabulary of Europeans interacting with them. This word became very derogatory in the 20th century, and as far as I know, it remains so in German. But it has been reappropriated by the independence movement in New Caledonia, and it is now a claimed term of national and cultural self-designation, so it's not derogatory at all in my lecture. So it's an example of a housing project in the capital city of Nouméa, and it's welcome in Kanakland. So it's the way people are claiming their own identity now. So back to my lecture. The study of conflict and political violence makes possible to understand the conditions of the unstable formation of groups in action. After this book, in the last decade, I've returned twice in New Caledonia to conduct new ethnographic surveys as part of two collective projects, one on customary justice in New Caledonia, and the other one on the experience of imprisonment. I spent 1 month last March on this theme. So these are, just to feel the ambience, two of the inmates I've met for the last project, and I'll be back to this guy soon. In this lecture, my aim is to incorporate an historical perspective in a pragmatic description of a violent situation through a case study of a murder, and to examine the social and political dynamics in a situation where violence takes place. In order to understand the complexity of a singular case, here a roadside murder, I will try to show that the interactionist study of a situation of violence is improved by a description of segmentary and antagonistic social relations and their historicity. So I will try both to put us in the very situation of the murder and also to give different layers of context to understand what happened, simply what happened in this situation. It's a roadside murder. It was just 50 meters from this place I took in picture just to see the context. I relied primarily on informal discussions and a few formal interviews with protagonists who were close to the situation. They could be witnesses, they could be family members, or they could be customary leaders in the village of the murder. And these people talked to me in 2015, 3 years after the murder, and last March. I think because they know me, they have been knowing me since 1991, because it's not a simple situation to come as a stranger from the colonial country and say, well, there was a murder, could you talk to me about your conflicts? So it's not the way we can do in an ethnographic research. We have to build some trust relationships. It's quite long and so on, but you know that. I begin by quoting some interviews I conducted in 2015 that renders the fatal shooting of a man I call John on August 2012 and the suicide of his eldest son 1 month later. In this extract, the murder is included in social relations, in relations of power. Here, in the short extracts I quote, by reference to an ancient conflict between two families, in relation to an institution, the position of chieftainship, to land disputes, and to political conflicts, locally called events. I will describe all this. So I quote 4 people. 1, it's a Sunday, boys were doing kebabs on the barbecue on the roadside. The gang of nephews and cousins then arrived. They said, hey, this is not your land here. They arrived by car and they began to yell and say, hey, you have to stop your barbecue. It's not your place. This is our land. John intervened because X or his dad wanted to hit one of his sons, one of John's sons. Hicks' dad said, go ahead, shoot. And John said, yes, go ahead, shoot. We didn't think he was going to shoot because John was kidding. Yes, go ahead, shoot. You see, he didn't look dangerous, but the other guy shot. He killed him. John's son committed suicide a month later at his grandfather's place with his rifle. It was devastating for him. After the death of his father, he didn't recover. Two, another man discussing with me. And the other family, what did they do? There is a gun in the car. That's how the shot went off. It's a wonderful description of the human agency. There is a gun in the car. That's how the shot went off. The man who killed John, he didn't want to kill him, as he shot him in the legs. That's how he hit the vein. John lost a lot of blood. As you may imagine, people talking here is not on John's side. He is defending the killer by this way of describing the situation. Three, the other family, they have claimed the leadership, the chieftainship. So in the first, they mentioned the land conflict. Here, they mentioned the chieftainship for a long time. And now it stays like that. John was killed, and now where are they? The killers. The man who did it, he is excluded from the village. Four, and last quotation, actually in 2015 I made 7 or 8 interviews with different people commenting on the case, and 2 other ones in 2019, but I quote just significant extract now. 4, it was a conflict between 2 families, but it goes back to the events of 1984 that are the political events with the upsurge of the independentist movement against European settlers that had consequences at the village scale between Kanak families, the one against the other. But John went to France, he came back. I think it was the second or the third time he returned. He had rekindled the flame. That's how things have degenerated. So I was not a witness to the scene of the murder, and I cannot describe the emotion of people involved. I have no access to the court or police documents. Even if they are incomplete, these interviews are more or less the only available sources on this violent situation. Just to summarize, a few days before John's return to France, I will explain, the day before his departure from Wailu to the capital city of Nouméa, a party is organized in his village by members of his family. Probably about 20 young people prepare kebabs by the roadside. Oh, that's it. From my own experience, I believe that some of them had some implements with them, such as machetes or knives, that are used for clearing the roads or for preparing the barbecue, but that can be used as weapons, obviously. And then 1 or 2 cars arrive with people from the same village coming back from a wedding in another village. They come back in their village and they stop and they yell at the barbecue party. And then at least 3 people living in the same village in conflicts with John's families, a gun in the car, went out of the car. They exchanged insults. John was a little farther away from the road with his sisters, but he listened and he understood that his son is being in the strife. So he goes to the roadside and then they exchange some words, I quote it, and John receives 1 or several gunshots. He dies on his son's laps in the car, taking him to the clinic, which is maybe 30 kilometers away. And his son commits suicide shortly afterwards. The fact that the two arriving cars, there were guns in the 2 arriving cars, now my interlocutors consider it as an obvious evidence of the premeditation of the murder. But it's difficult to say, because usually they don't travel with guns in the car. To understand such a scene of violence requires an analysis of social relations in the multiple dimensions, not only the scene of the murder and the interaction in the murder, but many layers of historicities and complexity. Here, I consider conflict between Kanak people of this village. I won't consider directly violence between European settlers and Kanak people, but the violent act in its specificity involves a contextualization reflecting structural violence. For instance, what we call chieftainship, the form of land issues, and political events, referred in the extract, are all informed by the history of colonization. We can't understand land issues now if we don't understand the form of French colonization in New Caledonia. So the stakes of the conflict mentioned in the interviews are internal stakes, but they are directly configured by the history of colonization in New Caledonia. And also the remoteness of many Kanak villages from administrative centers and medical facilities also testifies of the structural violence of the colonial history in New Caledonia. So, to understand the situation, we have to mobilize different logics of conflicts. In my work, violence situations are mainly heuristic levers to approach social relations in their complexity. My main objective is not to elaborate a theory on violence in general, but this kind of situation shows the complexity of all social situations, but in a very intense way. So the first dimension I would like to mention is the political importance of segmentary social relations in New Caledonia. Rather than defining a permanent institutional structure, segmentarity describes a type of action. According to the situation he or she is part of, an individual can refer to different levels of social belonging to seek support. For instance, in the situation of land reform in New Caledonia and land reallocation to the Kanak people, opportunities for conflicts are particularly numerous. I wrote my first book on these land issues. Two clans, two families in conflict over a piece of land may at the same time be united against another grouping of clans in a claim on another piece of land. So I took the classical anthropological model of segmentary opposition in anthropological literature, which is a book of Evans Pritchard, a British anthropologist, on the Nuer Society of South Soudan. The book is 1940. And it's a model of how a society can live without chiefs, without a state. And the idea in Evans Pritchard's book is that the groups don't exist permanently, but they form in a situation of conflicts. And for instance, in this model, the group B forms itself when it is opposed to another group, for instance, another family, let's say A. But in another situation of conflicts, B can divide between X and Y if they are opposed in another land conflict. If I am opposed to my neighbor, So X will form against Y. But if we oppose to U that are from the other village, we are going all together to form our collective group in the situation to oppose the other group. So that's the classical description of segmentary relationships. Segmentary structural principle of fission and fusion, so the group divide or unite depending on the situation, take empirically the form of an extraordinary ambivalence of feelings and emotions that run through social relations. Because I can love or act with a man I'm opposed to in another situation. So it's very tense, actually, this kind of situation, because my own family can divide in some situation and unite in another one. So the groups are very relative. So in his book Violence, Randall Collins develops a pragmatic analysis of physical aggressions and other. He develops a situational analysis of violence. He emphasizes the situational dynamics of violence, including emotion. And he said that the most pervasive emotion in situation of violent threat is confrontational tension fear. The more difficult for a violent act to happen is to overcome my fear. So he analyzes the pragmatic conditions that lead to violence. In what situation we can overcome our fear of violence to become violent. So he examined the number of people present, type of dialogic exchanges, characteristic of the people watching, forms of control of tension and fears, and so on. So he is very precise in developing this characterization. For instance, he explains that the better situation to overcome my fear is being in a group of 5 or 6 against just one people, and so we can entertain ourselves and be quite confident on the fact that we can beat him. But well, it depends on. But anyhow, and the same if the audience encourage people to be violent, they can be. If they say no, stop. If they so this is the kind of pragmatic description of the situation to understand when a situation becomes violent. But this micro-sociological analysis leaves some question open. How is the audience of a violent situation constructed? What are the local form or the cultural forms of mobilization of the emotion resources of actors? Are this kind of emotion universal? How the group's solidarity is built up? Are there cultural forms of emotions? Is the fear or the confidence the same in New Caledonia or in Germany? And moreover, this pragmatic perspective leaves the temporal dynamics of violence largely unexplored. Is there a connection between the former experience of violence of all people involved in the situation or not? So Collins is conscious of this question, these dimensions. So I quote him, "What we need above all is a model incorporating time dynamics, explaining how long social emotional resources are effective." So we want to combine the actual emotional resources in a situation of violence and the contextual dimension and time dynamics of the situation. But as far as I know, it's only a project in Randall Collins' wonderful work. It's the extract I've already read. 2 dimensions Collins developed in his book about the emotional dynamics of a situation of violence are very important to understand the scene I have just described. First, the importance of the audience in the confrontation, as onlookers can either help those in the confrontation to overcome their fear and become violent, or on the contrary can be a factor in stopping it. Collins said that the bigger the audience is, well, it's a result of a comparative research on situations of violence. The bigger the audience is, the more likely violence is to occur if those watching support the transition to the violent act. If many people encourage violence, so it can happen. In this situation, first John's sister tried to retain him and to impede him to go to the roadside and to meet the 30 or 40 people that were there. And finally, due to his connection to his son, he went, and then it was not only 2 people involved in a brawl, it was John within an audience of 40 people. And Collins say, if people are not encouraging the violence, so a balance is sought by bragging and exchanges of insult. I will kill you, don't approach, and so on. But it's a way to let the tension go down. So in this situation, on one side, the father's words, go ahead, shoot, or another guy told me, he said, kill him, is a way to encourage violence, of course. But on the other side, the victim, John, seems to seek a situational balance by joking in the guise of bragging. Yes, go ahead, shoot. So here we are on the verge of 2 logics that Collins developed. Are they encouraging violence, or are they bragging and looking for an equilibrium? And a second important thing that Collins insisted on is the fact that physical distancing makes the violent act easier. So here, the son, X and his son, they didn't go to John to how do you say? To punch him, to beat him, but they used a gun. So even with fear, you can just put your finger on the trigger. So these are direct Collins results. It may seem quite obvious, but it is a result of hundreds of description of violent scenes, and to compare situation where we go to violence and injuries and murder, and situation where we don't go. So these are very interesting situational results. But I'm going to add some historical perspective here and try to put, as I said, layers of context. I haven't looked at my watch, so I don't know how long I've been talking.
15 minutes.
Okay, great. So, the taking into account of John's carry is an occasion to observe the social construction of emotions and the temporal dynamics of the building of audiences and of group solidarity connected to a violent situation. This will allow us to understand that the meanings of emotion, gestures, words are not universal, are not self-obvious, even for the actors of the interaction that culminated in John's murder. So, I met John during my first stay at Weilou in 1991. Here he is, in 1991, with his eldest son with him. So John was killed 20 years later, and his son committed suicide. So I met him in 1991, and he became a friend. So it's quite emotional for me to have learned him being murdered, and to have made this ethnographic fieldwork on his death. In 1991, I lived there in Weilou with a man, Albert, and his wife. At that time, John and his partner were also living with Albert because they couldn't leave John and his partner together in their village, because the fact that they were all together was not accepted by their families due to former conflict during the events on 1984. During these events, in the village, John's family, with his murderer's family, with X family, they were independentist guys, and they put outside of the village the family of John's partner. So in 1984, John's family and his murderer's family, they were united to put another family outside of the village. But the consequences in 1991, 7 years after, that nobody wanted them, John and his partner, to marry, because there were this conflict between their two families. Is it clear enough? Okay. It will become more complicated afterwards, so I'm rather to... So he was not living in his village, but in another place. A few weeks before my arrival in Weilou, John was instrumental, critical, in pacifying a confrontational interaction at the edge of a murder. Albert, the man we lived at his place, Albert, was very close to kill his own uncle in a land conflict. They were disputing over who was authorized to speak on the land. And so Albert was effectively, I was not there, but he told me he was with a rifle, and his uncle fell on the road, and he was there, and at that moment John yelled at him and said, "No, think about your daughter." And so Albert didn't push the trigger, and John took the rifle and threw it away. So what I want to say is that John was not ontologically violent. It was not a part of his temper, let's say. It's important for the following. And when I met him, I was quite struck by his quite impressive physical appearance, and also because he was quite shy and kind to me. These people, John and Albert, they were very involved in the independentist fight, Kanak fight against white settlers. So they were very embarrassed to receive me as a white French guy, younger at that time. But I had connection through the independentist parties So they had some confidence in a way. But they were not used to meet people. So he was very shy with me. And, his grandfather had enlisted in the French army during both world wars. And his father also was a military man who participated in World War II and afterwards in the French Indochina War. From these family experiences of his grandfather and father, John received his Kanak first name, Diemao, meaning literally it means spear and axe, two weapons, but it's a way to designate a warrior. His name was Warrior, not John, but Warrior. His father, back from Indochina, displayed very violent behavior in his family. I mean, he deployed domestic violence against John's mother and against his sons. So his mother left with their sons, and John spent his youth in different places. He was long raised by his maternal grandparents, but he lived in different places. Domestic violence is far from being exceptional in New Caledonia, but John's father was especially violent, as it is described by people around. When he became an adult, John was himself responsible for direct physical violence in different ways. He participated in fights, in beatings, in shootings. During the period of the events, he shooted with a gun, with a rifle, to white settlers' cars. It was a period of intense tension between pro-independence Kanak activists and European and Kanak opponents of independence. Afterwards, he participated in several fights during the land reform that followed these events. And he was also involved in two main local conflicts in his own village. In 1993, he began a period of significant cannabis use and a drift he was very tensed and very paranoid, and he was very stressed by his uncle who prevented him to marry. So he was more and more tensed, and in 1994 I was in France and I learned that John's great uncle, that I knew him, I made some interviews with him, had died after a fight with John's. He died due to his injuries, so we don't know exactly, but we can imagine that John's intention was not to kill him, but he broke an internal organ, I think the liver, or I don't know exactly, and so the old man died. Obsessed by the fear of being attacked by witchcraft, thwarted by several members of his family, including this old man, from getting married, he accused his great uncle of being one of the responsible instigators of his misfortune. So he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. He actually spent 11 years in prison, first in New Caledonia, then in 3 different jails in France, where I had the occasion to visit him. During this period, he was able to transform himself before being freed on parole. In this decade, contrasting with the previous one, where he was very violent, he participated only in one fight in prison, when he knocked out a prisoner who accused him of being a snitch. So it's clearly necessary to contextualize the type of confrontation, the type of audience, the type of emotion that were involved, that drove John to violence. So he was not permanently violent, and I mean, jail is a very violent setting. There are a lot of fights between the inmates. Well, it depends on the jails and the countries and the situation, but there are many violent occasions. And so in these 10 years, with many occasions to fight, he didn't. After several years following his release on parole in France, he made a few short visits to New Caledonia. And I put here, it's a photograph I took this year of people he met at that time, of not the younger one, but it is his wife and his younger daughter, who was born when he was in prison, and his grandson that he didn't know. So he made a few short visits to New Caledonia, but he decided not to reinstall there, not to move back there, in order to escape internal problems related to different situations. First, there were some tension inside his family, between his uncle branch and his branch, of course, because he killed his uncle. So there was this tension. But there was also the tension between his family and his wife's family. Well, his partner family, because they were not married. And also the conflict about land and the position of chief of the village between his family and his later murderous family began to being more and more important. So when he came back to New Caledonia, there were a lot of emotions, a lot of conflicts that were recapturing him. By contrast, in France, in the large town of southern France where he lived, he acquired a reputation as advisor and mediator among Kanak students and residents of this town. So he was, let's say, a wise man. He was considered as a wise man by the younger Kanak students there. So in prison, and then in France, outside prison, he entered into other emotional and interactional settings than the violent ones he was socialized in New Caledonia. So he was quite a violent guy in New Caledonia. During 10 years, he made a lot of violent actions. And in another setting, in France, he took some distance. And for instance, one guy told me that John wrote him 2 letters during his imprisonment. Just after the sentence, the condemnation, he wrote a letter to another guide of his village saying, "When I will be free, I will come back and I will kill you." And then 5 years later, he wrote a second letter and say, "I will come back and I will say, forgive me. I will make a customary gesture to ask for you to settle the situation because I was responsible." So it's an indication of this kind of personal transformation. But this transformation was his transformation. It was not the transformation of the audience in Wailu. of the situation. In August 2012, the words he said were very, very ambiguous. We can imagine that with the reputation of a violent guy, of a tough guy, who spent 11 years in prison, when he came back, the other families, they were afraid, actually. So the emotional setting of the interaction is quite important to understand. And the meaning of John's words just before his death, yes, go ahead, shoot. First of all, I don't know the tone. I was not a witness. I don't know if he was really laughing. Yes, go ahead, shoot. Or if it was much more bragging, yes, go ahead, shoot. And so I don't have the knowledge on this point. But anyhow, these words can be understood as a joke or as a boast to diffuse tension, or on the contrary, they can be understood as a provocation, as an insult, precipitating the violent act. But nobody can say for sure. So the interactional emotions that are so important in Randall Collins' theory are not very easy to determine, even for the actors of the situation. I mean, the audience, we don't know how they... I quoted one example of one guy saying it was a joke, but for sure, the young man that killed him thought it was not a joke. So the forms, expression, meanings of emotions, of gestures, of words are not universal, are not transparent, even in the situation. So John's socialization, the intimate experience of domestic violence, the experience of violence as a common repertoire of action in village conflicts. He is not the only violent guy in New Caledonia, for sure. Setting a problem with a fight is quite common in this kind of situation. So his own violent practice in the decade 84-94 are understandable only in the context of the structural tensions of his social position, of his family, of his village. He was involved in two main oppositions. He was the oldest man in the eldest lineage of his family. So it's a classical representation of a family tree in social anthropology formalism. Here with triangle we represent only men, which can be discussed a lot, but anyhow. Here I took a classical image of segmentary conflict. As I mentioned, in one situation, for instance, all this group of people descending of this man, they can unite against all this group if they have got a conflict. But they can all unite against another family, or this group one, they can divide between the A group and the B group. Depends. So if we imagine that of a representation of his family, John was here. He was, if we imagine the elder to be on that side and the younger to be on that side. He was the elder of the oldest branch of his family. And he was in conflict with two men, his uncle and his great-uncle that he killed here. So this tension between a young and legitimate elder of the eldest branch versus older men in age but younger in the legitimacy, let's say, it is very classical, not only in New Caledonia, it's very typical of segmentary lineage tensions. So we can't understand the murder of his uncle without this structural organization of family life. This is a point of structural tension in all lineage contexts. These two old men made many things to prevent him marrying his partner, and it means to become a complete legitimate adult. And this conflict between the two branches of the family, the blue one and the orange one, is still actual currently, but without many of the guys. These tensions, the second important conflict was the long-term conflict between his family and his murderer family on land and village chieftainship. I won't develop the reason of it, but there are two conflicting ways of narrating history of the village and the legitimacy of the different families in the village. So these tensions he was involved in contributed to the creation of the spectators of the 2012 confrontation. I mean, all this tension and the position of John in these tensions, they were conscious to all the audience that know that there were so many conflicts John was in and that he was used to react by violence to it. Some of my interviewees this year insisted on his re-inclusion in the local opposition, that in New Caledonia he was not as wise as in France. This emotional ambiguity cost him his life as well as his son's life. In this case, the ambiguity on the macro-structural level of segmentary kinship created occasions for conflicts. And the ambiguity of the conversational interaction, yes, go ahead, shoot, created ambiguity on the micro-situational level. So the structural ambiguities and the situational ambiguities multiplied the probability of violence to take place. Ambiguity in a situation increases the risk of violence, especially when the hierarchical relationships between two individuals or two groups are not clearly established. And this is the case in segmentary situations. To understand the stakes of this barbecue party and the car stopping at the barbecue means to understand both the personal history of John and the collective history of this familial tension. So we can only notice this combination of segmentary tensions and emotional ambiguities. And in this situation, it seems to me that the violent act keeps a contingent dimensions. For instance, we don't know if the leg injury was intentional, if the shooter wanted to kill John or just to injure John, we don't know. And there's still an hazardous dimension to the violent act. But I believe that we cannot understand it without combining the description of the situation and the layers of context that configure at least the audience of the situation. Let me add to conclude that X, the shooter, the killer, was sentenced to 9 years in prison. His father, who encouraged him to shoot, was sentenced to 5 years. including 2 suspended years that he was not obliged to make. So during my last stay in March, this old man was free. I have to confess that I didn't discuss the case with him. I had not the courage to meet him. But I have to add that the second inmate I showed a photograph of is a member of the murderer's family, and we made a thorough discussion about his experience of prison, and in describing his experience of prison, he often referred to John's experience of prison, saying, well, I know that he spent a lot of time in prison. We had the same experience of how difficult the prison experience is. So he was able to be very close to John, and then he concluded, yes, but he was wrong. He pretended that his family was the chief's family, but it's mine. And so he shouldn't have been back in New Caledonia. And so he too was re-involved in the structural conflict. Thus, an ethnographic methodology attentive to the historicity of social facts completes the interactionist analysis of situations of violence and takes into account several additional dimensions of their complexity. I'm sorry for my English, but I'd like to thank you for your patience.